Hi everyone, welcome to the YAM Podcast. My name is Nal Hachmin and welcome to another week episode of the YAM Podcast. Every Thursdays, yo. We're super excited to introduce to you this week's guest, Dr. Elena Mustakova. I have been wanting to speak to her for ages. And literally it took a member in the Yoga Avec Moi membership portal to request her for me to be reaching out to her. I'm so excited to share with you our first ever conversation ever on the YAM Podcast. We're going to welcome her again for the December monthly guest lecture 2022. If you're hearing this afterwards, you know that there's going to be a replay in the membership portal. So if you want to catch that as well, you're welcome to join us there. And without further ado, here is Dr. Elena Mustakova. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the YAM Podcast. My name is Nala Hachmin, and I am its host. We're super excited to invite Dr. Elena Mustakova to the YAM Podcast. I have actually been wanting to speak to you for now 2 years now. I learned about you 2 years ago from a friend of mine, and they shared with me your wonderful YouTube series. Every now and then, people keep on telling me, they're like, oh, I speak to Dr. Elena Mustakova. They're like, she's so amazing. She's helped me a lot. And I'm actually really happy that the first time I'm speaking to you is on the podcast. So welcome, Dr. Mustakova.
Thank you very much. And just to make it easier on you, everybody calls me Dr. Elena, so you don't have to struggle with my longer last name. I'm very pleased to be here today. Thank you for inviting me.
We're so excited to have you. You were actually requested on the Yoga Avec Moi membership portal. That's how we got to invite you over. We were in the Yoga Avec Moi membership portal and we were speaking about the topic of jealousy and jealousy in the classroom and between female leaders, and just what do you do with jealousy when it comes in? And one of the members asked, I was like, oh, I've been listening to this woman, or I know of this woman named Dr. Elena Mustakova, and she talks a lot about really amazing things, and I would really love to hear her perspective on it. And I'm like, oh, I know of her. Let's bring her on the YAM Podcast. Let's definitely have a chat, because I think this would be really wonderful. Regarding this question about jealousy, maybe just to satisfy the members, I know you're going to be coming into the membership portal soon, so we can go deep into that conversation. But just for now, is there anything that on the topic of jealousy, if I ask you this question of jealousy, what comes up with you? What has shown up in your practice in regards to this quality, and how do you usually go about talking to your clients about dealing with feelings of jealousy?
That's actually a very good question and a great way to jump in, because when we start to think about what jealousy actually is expressing, we very quickly realize the depth of what people of all ages struggle with. We actually live in a very difficult social time where the dominant paradigm is one of competition, and competition against each other. And that competition is basically infused into people's consciousness from the get-go, from the start, from little children. And if you internalize, as most people have, that your value is only relative to how you score in relation to other people, then of course jealousy is a very understandable inner struggle. And so we are all in a way subject to this sad conditioning. And so what's very important is, whether I work with adults or whether parents are raising children, to really teach from the beginning a child that they are inherently noble, that they are unique, they are noble, and their task in this life is really to discover their own potentialities and develop them. And that the contribution they will be making in the world is unique to them and does not need comparisons to other people. What it really needs is deep listening inward in order to recognize what is the inner hunger, what is the inner dis-ease, what is the inner restlessness that is prompting these other more outward feelings. And so really understanding that jealousy signaling a certain inner hunger or dis-ease and dealing with that would be my approach consistently, and certainly has been my approach in raising my daughter from the get-go, always reminding her, just take time and listen to your inner voice. Listen, take quiet time, draw, do what makes you happy, and listen inward. What is actually happening? And helping her know from the beginning, from a very young child, really from toddlerhood, that if she takes quiet time to listen inward, she will know what she needs, and then she can find a way to communicate it to me. So jealousy really, whether in children or in adults, is an unmet inner need, some kind of insecurity that is trying to speaking in the language of jealousy, because that's what we're conditioned for. We're conditioned for competition, and especially difficult for women, because we are still dealing with a men's world, a very much a deeply entrenched patriarchy, which may have some more polished ways of appearing more liberated on the surface in some parts of the world, the more westernized parts of the world. But there's plenty of evidence that violence against women and structural violence against women is completely embedded in every society, and that even in societies that pay token lip service to the liberation of women are set to compete against men, and they always lose. And then, of course, the sense in a woman who's trying to break the glass ceiling is, I'm competing against other women who are also trying to break the glass ceiling, because it's going to be the rare one amongst us that just might succeed. So just really, again, talking with women about the structural dynamics that we're living. These are deep issues, and they manifest in these more superficial ways, but they signal a lot of deeper struggles.
I love that so much. That's something very coherent with what a yogic principle often I share in the membership portal, which is like this concept of, before we were born, we were like one with source. And then we looked down upon creation, and we saw a very unique service that we wanted to fulfill. And what we did was, from that oneness of universe, we actually took so much pain to actually become a single identity. And it took about 3 months before conception for God to prepare us, for the oneness to prepare that single individual to descend onto this world. And so even before the egg meets the embryo, 3 months prior to this, your parents are chosen, your gender is chosen, all to help assist this purpose and to fulfill its mission on this planet. So one of the things that we often talk about in the membership portal is, if you were to pretend, even if you didn't believe it, pretend like this was true, what would you think that you looked upon this earth to come and fulfill? What was the unique service that your soul so longed for to come on this planet to fulfill? And that usually gets people like so excited, and they're like, they go inside and they're like, whoa, if this was true, then it draws them inwards into that self, into that, perhaps it's that aspect of the need that you're talking about, but maybe it's not even an understanding of that. That's the like language to describe it. Actually, this might be a wonderful segue to go into, you were also, one of the members was sharing that sorry, was there something that you wanted to share?
Yes, I wanted to step in with what you said and just clarify what I actually meant here before we go into the next topic.
Please.
I understand that there are different spiritual beliefs about what happens before the moment of conception or during the moment of conception. I don't necessarily mean what you were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
From my own spiritual perspective, conception is the moment of the beginning of an individual's soul. And so what I really meant from my spiritual understanding is that from the moment the individual soul emanates from the whole, which from my understanding is the moment of conception, that soul is gifted with a matrix of potentialities. And it is in this physical life that it is our task to bring those forth and to find what is the most meaningful configuration in which these potentialities can serve humanity. And so when I talk about listening inward, it is not that we already have it all formed and clearly chosen. I don't mean it that way. Psychologically, there is a much deeper evolutionary process in the lifespan. But what I mean is that as we listen inward, our soul speaks to us, and our potentialities speak to us about the need to be fulfilled. And as we pay attention to these things, we little by little realize what is the next step before us, and then the next step, and then the next step. And eventually, our unique place and our unique service in the world emerges as we also evolve onto it. From a psychological developmental perspective, we come as a pure and very unique potentiality. And that potentiality is a matter of choice and free will to gradually, very gradually, realize and actualize and bring forth and then find a place for its ability to serve humanity. That's how it expresses itself, through service to humanity. So it's an evolutionary developmental process that involves deep listening inward. It is not a static given that we just have to pull the veil off of. It's not as simple. It's a very profound process. And in that process, we need to be educated and accompanied. So I just wanted to clarify what I was referring to.
Completely.
Thank you.
I love that clarification so much, because I think it's interesting where a sweeping statement that I made before of like a yogic principle like that could be understood in that way. It's really fascinating because I would say it's actually quite coherent with the same thing that I shared. It's just using like a different language, like the same thing of that purpose that's shown. It's not specifically like a job or like you're a nurse or you're a doctor. It doesn't show up like that, but it's more like certain qualities or characteristics or themes. For instance, care or virtues expressed as virtues. So these potentialities that you speak of are really potentialities of the soul. So they're qualities of the soul that are there and that really need to be refined, of course, through effort and all these things. They don't just pop up. In yoga, there's a lot of discipline. There's a lot of discipline to get those virtues out. So definitely effort is required for sure.
And also, I would say just recognizing that as we listen inward, there is always learning to discern between our own fancies and that deeper voice. That is not a simple process. So I appreciate the fact that you mentioned discipline. And that's why it's important to really stay within what we can, with a measure of certainty at this point, know. It's hard for us to speak with certainty about the spiritual realm because we don't really know. These are various projections, various stories that we tell ourselves about what happens before the physical life. We really, there are different narratives. There's so many different narratives, but at the end of the day, we have to recognize that these are different narratives. We don't have direct access into that knowing. But what we do have direct access into is recognizing the uniqueness of every soul. We can see that when we listen carefully. We also can recognize how every unique soul, anybody who's raised a child, has maybe observed how different children come within their own family. they're raised very similarly, but they're so different. Obviously, the uniqueness of a soul is a very clear phenomenon. And then also how, as you guide them with sensitivity to recognize their own dignity, their own uniqueness, and to be thoughtful and disciplined in listening inward, they find their way very gradually. So these are things we have observed, things we know. And so staying within the parameters of that is definitely my goal. I appreciate and respect different narratives because, of course, we live by our stories, the stories that we tell ourselves, but we also have to know the difference between the stories we tell ourselves and what we can observe and what we can directly work with. And so I just thought it was important to clarify that. But you were trying to lead me on to another topic. So please, back to you.
I did. I was going to lead you into the topic of precision of language, which we are very beautifully already just demonstrating as we speak. But I actually, before we jump into that conversation, I did want to actually share, because this is a very big topic that we cover in terms of how do you discern your vain imaginings to your true voice. So I would die to hear your perspective on this, of how do you go about teaching people how to discern their vain imaginings and their true inner voice. What is the guide and compass that you use? Because there are so many different narratives. One of the first things that I learned in my yoga teacher training was the first topic was the theme of Prakriti and Purusha. Prakriti was of the world of change and everything that changes, and everything is in here except two things. One was God, and the second was the human soul, the eternal life of the human soul. And Purusha, in the yogic symbol, the Om symbol, I don't know if you've seen it before, has these little squiggles, but the dot is distinguished by Purusha. And the dot, to me, if I relate it to, I have my other spiritual discipline, which is the Baha'i faith, of course, the quote that is, knowledge is a single point which the ignorant multiply. I am always trying to stay within the point and not to go into the multiplication of things. So when people say things to me in terms of spiritual, exactly what you were sharing from the different narratives, I'm always trying to find, just like in a Baha'i house of worship on the dome of it, how all of the 9 sides all point to one direction. I only care about that point. And so I would love to hear your perspective of your side of how you get to that point when it comes to the topic of vain imaginings and your inner voice.
That's a very good question. And I appreciate the way you referred to that Quranic quote of the single point. That is really the wisdom of this life journey on this plane, is growing into a recognition of that single point and alignment with that single point. That, I would say, is the journey of a lifetime. It is not something that we come with except as a potentiality. In fact, I just recently published a book called Global Unity of Healing, in which I would very much encourage your participants to consider reading, because what this book describes is precisely the question that you just asked, which is the journey of growing in discernment, which is a lifelong journey. It's a developmental journey, but it really takes a step-by-step, practically clinical approach to describing the lifelong journey of growing into discernment, so that we can discern the single point in the 10,000 things and stay calm and aligned with that center. So the book actually takes you through the steps that in my 30 plus years of clinical practice, I've been helping guide people into, and describes them through clinical vignettes of life cases, etc. And it's really describes all the building blocks in this process. But to keep it simpler for our conversation today, I will say that as we begin to turn inward and really learn to quiet our minds, that is the first key step, because our personal minds are very attached to our beliefs, our stories, our opinions, or the I. But the life journey is about truly recognizing the limitations of that perspective and gradually transcending it. And so as we launch into this life journey, especially as children, of course, we have to develop a strong sense of I, a strong sense of self, because it's our internal orientation without which we really cannot function in the human social world. However, to also learn that the I is limited and it has a lot of stories and it talks pretty loud in the human head. And so when you go inward, you really have to quiet those voices. You have to leave them at the threshold. You have to allow yourself to not be so detached to them, to create some space between yourself and all your inner voices and stories about I like this and I don't like that, and I always do this and I never do that, and etc., etc. This is our personal world. We all live in it. But the voice of discernment is much quieter, much subtler, and it can only be heard when the personal world quiets, which is why children hear this voice intuitively when they get engaged into creative flow, which is why we now say that play, creative play, is so important for children. Opening space for that, not hurrying them, not always thinking about the next thing they should be doing or activities that we have planned for them, but giving them that quiet space to find the creative play that moves them and to get into flow with it. This flow state is a very important psychological state, which is now quite well described as a state where we actually are more detached from our personal world and we're flowing with our creative impulse in the moment, which means that we're also detached enough from our personal world that we hear that subtler voice. Very interesting. So parents often tell me, if I don't plan activities for my child, she's bored. And I will say, tell her to stay bored. Tell her that it's okay to be bored. Leave her space to be bored and just watch. She will be bored for only a few minutes. If she understands that you're not providing her, not spoon feeding her the next entertainment, she will be bored for only a few minutes before she will engage in something, find something, discover, create something that really speaks to her inner self and get her flow. So leaving kids space to be bored and emptying their space from outward entertainments is actually very wise and exactly what parents are taught not to do these days, of just filling the spaces of children with iPads and lots of toys and lots of planned activities so that they can compete intellectually against the next child. And that's already the backdrop thinking of a parent. That's the conditioning. It's really tragic. And it creates children that are on this external rat race, neurotic, not peaceful. So to loop full circle back to the original question, discernment grows throughout the lifespan, and it's a developmental process. Again, it is described in Global Unity of Healing. But in the micro moment, we access discernment as we quiet the personal world and we quiet the voices of our personal thinking, or create space between ourselves and them. And from a Baha'i spiritual perspective, we are encouraged when we approach our communion with the greater realm, we are encouraged to leave all of our opinions behind. And that's not a bad, it's a wonderful thing, because it opens creative space for insight to arise in each next moment, which is how insight in fact arises. And it, again, it's usually quiet and subtle.
I love that you shared to just be bored. That is like gold. That is so gold that I've always thought it's always like almost like a motto in yoga to just be. But I've never actually heard the connection with be bored. And I think that's something that a lot of people are gonna be latching onto, especially for me. I'm lately getting really bored in my meditation practices. I can sit longer and longer periods of time just by myself doing nothing. And lately there's been this numbing boredom of just, wow, I do the same thing every single day. And it's usually, I know that this is like right before the point of something amazing is about to happen. So I get excited also when I get bored, but sometimes when it's just like purely painful, I like how you just, that sentence was just like perfect. And to be like, be bored. If that's what you're being right now, be it then. I love that. There's so many questions I want to ask you. I want to ask you about language, but actually, since you mentioned your book about global health, this was actually the original reason why someone recommended me to you. Because I'm actually originally trained. My master's is in control of infectious diseases, and my whole thing is about global health. And this has actually happened all before the whole yoga thing came about. And the reason why it came about was actually because I was working on the outbreaks of Ebola and H7N9 on a global level. And it was so stressful. Doing outbreak work was 24 hours, and this was in 2014. And I had to start meditating in order to just actually go to work. And I had to, when I left work, I had to shut off my email so I wouldn't get notifications. Otherwise, the whole night, because there's in different time zones, I would be getting notifications every day. And my job was the job where I would sound the initial alarm of any country that would basically report a case. So my job was like sounding the alarm. Hey guys, hey team, we need to pay attention. This country did this and stuff like that. So it was nonstop. I remember one day I had 2,000 cases that I had to input into the digital sphere of the symptoms of cases and all these things. I was like, I came in 2 hours earlier. I left 2 hours later. It was the first time that I understood how dangerous the city was that I lived in. And the next day, 5 people were hired in order to do my job. I wasn't even aware of the largeness of the kind of issues. And so my whole introduction of the meditation, definitely, I was practicing physical yoga for 10 years prior to that, but I didn't really get into the meditation. The meditation was really during that work period. And what I realized was I had to meditate before I went to work. Otherwise, I couldn't focus. But then I realized when I got to work, I was the only person focusing. Everyone was in their flight or fright zone in their body, and they just weren't thinking. And everyone in the room that I was in, the couple decision makers were the decision makers for the global world. And so it's very dangerous to me that people were not present, and so many lives were in their hands. I was like, there is no other room that other decisions are being made. I'm like, this is the room that all the decisions are being made. And I'm like, this is not a good room to be in. And so I realized that actually the problem in the whole public health sphere was actually not the fact that people didn't know how to protect physical bodies, masses of physical bodies. At that point, nobody was talking about mental health. Right now, since the global pandemic has hit, everyone has an understanding of the mental health importance of a human being because of quarantine. And that was actually one of the things that I was working on, was the ethics of quarantine, of keeping a family together, and how it breaks children's psyches and actually loses their detachment when a 2-year-old child is separated from their parents. And I'm like, you need to keep the family together and pour more money to keep the family together, because even if you save the physical body of that child, there's no purpose to the mind or the future attachment. This child is like forever traumatized. Now, going into yoga, my number one thing is actually the spiritual health of the global world. And this is not yet a point which we're at yet as a society. We raised very quickly, I would say, and I thank COVID for this very much, that very suddenly we moved from the physical importance to the mental importance. I don't even know what will have to happen for us to move from the mental health awareness to the spiritual health awareness. And I have a feeling that you already talk about this book. You already talk about this in your book. And I was just wondering if there's any thoughts that you have to share about that perspective, and whether you think that for us all to actually, this is why I'm actually so obsessed with learning many different languages and perspectives of different spiritual corners, to broaden my language, which is actually what I want to talk to you about, is how language plays a part in this whole dynamic. I just like literally just spit out the world to you and then asked you to comment about it through language. So I don't know what this question is, but I have a feeling that you already know where to enter and know where to go with something like this. So please just share all your thoughts with me.
Thank you, first of all, for sharing your journey. I really appreciate hearing this, and very much appreciate the kind of progression of questions that you experienced, from working in global health to recognizing the power of meditation, and then recognizing that we finally moved into a recognition of mental health, but there is a beyond that we're still not quite realizing. And you are correct that I do write about this progression in the same book, because one of the first things I do with clients is to ask them to begin a meditation practice as a way to learn to quiet the mind. That is an essential step in the insane, turbulent, insecure, unsafe world in which we live, in which otherwise people very legitimately are in fight-flight mode all the time, which is, as you have noticed.
I was going to ask, do you have any favorite meditation practices? What's your first couple go-tos? If I have no idea where to start, what are the first things that you like to suggest?
I always say start with guided meditation. There are excellent apps for guided meditation, and people get to choose.
What are some, just out of curiosity?
Is one. Another one was Insight Meditation. There's an app. I also like very much the guided meditations of Tara Brach on her website. But these are places to start, and people sometimes try Calm. I've not been as fond of that. It's individual. The important thing is, and there's so much out there that really these are just things I'm mentioning. The important thing is to start, in my view, with guided meditation, because the mind is so loud that it takes a voice, a different voice, to remind you to quiet yourself, to catch you when you've drifted into active thinking. And so that's a good place to start, and also to guide you into body awareness. But that's a little bit more of a detailed conversation, so I'm going to just move forward from that. As people learn to experience a quiet mind, they can progress in their practice. They can do their own insight meditation or classic meditation approaches and choose among them. Transcendental meditation is excellent. So I'm not here to recommend a particular type of meditation. I'm here to say that the first step is to experience what a quiet mind actually feels like, because we have no idea. Once you experience what a quiet mind feels like, when you get back into your ordinary functioning, you go, ouch, oh, this is noisy, this is stressful, I don't really like this. So now you have a frame of reference that there is an alternative. And the more you know that there is an alternative, the more you want to come back to that alternative. That is the first step. But in the book, where there's a whole chapter devoted to the nature and dynamics of a healthy mind. That chapter is followed by a chapter on the role of heart in the stabilizing of mind. And while we talk about the role of heart, we are now talking about spiritual realities. We're talking about the fact that the heart is the seat of spiritual insight. The heart has a way of knowing which is radically different than the processes of the rational mind. And that this way of knowing, in fact, stabilizes the rational mind. And there is now plenty of research, amazing research, mostly carried out in the Heart Math Institute in California, that shows that the physical heart, in fact, has a function in that. The physical heart is not just a pump. It is an energetic, a potent energetic organ, in fact, far more potent than the human brain, about 1,000 times more potent energetic field around the human physical heart than around the human brain. And for people who have meditation and spiritual practices, because I don't equate meditation with spiritual practice, I think spiritual practice goes beyond meditation. And I'll say something about that in a moment. But for those people, the heart energy field could be up to 10,000 times stronger than the brain. And that energy, as we know, is vibrating information. So the heart actually has a way of knowing. But we have to also be very cautious, back to our previous conversation, because the heart has to be corrected by the rational understanding of the mind, as the mind also has to be humbled by the profound intuitions of the heart. It is really this dialectic that leads to discernment. To come to the role of spiritual health, the way I see it from a psycho-spiritual perspective is to understand the power of what I call a heart-mind epistemology. So epistemology is that branch of philosophy that describes how we come to know. And how we come to know very much depends on what we consider reality, which is our ontology. As we recognize that reality is fundamentally spiritual, it is essentially consciousness, which is what advanced physics and other sciences are now confirming, then we recognize that we need to amplify and develop those powers within us that have direct access, or more direct access, shall we say, because we don't know if it's really direct. This is in the realm of what we don't know, but direct enough, or relatively more direct access into spiritual reality, and that is the powers of the heart, when corrected and kept in check by a disciplined rational mind. And so heart-mind epistemology, or a whole person way of knowing, which is a different way to speak about it, was discussed in my chapter 4 that follows the chapter on mind. And it shows very clearly that spiritual health is the epitome of health. And it's interesting that from there you want to take us into language, because that's where my part 1 ends, with the power of spiritual health to integrate physical, emotional, mental, and psychological health. And then I go into part 2 of the book, which is all about language, and the way language really constructs us, and how we can reconstruct ourselves through language, through a much more conscious choice of language, which brings me back to the excellent point that you made, that it is important for us to be exposed to different spiritual languages, and to really, as much as possible, discern the points of convergence among them, and to keep our language, our spiritual language, evolving, so that it can really help us become a new creation. which is something that the Baha'i writings are very rich in references to, that in this age of awakening, collective awakening, we're called upon to become a new creation. And as I understand it, at least from a psychological perspective, we are created and conditioned in growing up in a society, in societies that are generally quite driven by a materialistic ontology. And it really doesn't matter if you're growing up in India or the southern parts of Africa or the Western world, because whatever spiritual narratives people have, they are held very materialistically. They're held through physical ritual, I would say physicalist maybe understanding is pervasive. There's very little genuine spiritual understanding in the world yet. And so we are first created through these kind of physicalist, society-driven processes that are limiting, very limiting of our true potentiality. But then at some point, we become conscious beings because we become able to be conscious of our consciousness. From the point that we become conscious of our consciousness, we can choose how we direct it. From that point on, which from a Baha'i perspective is around 15, but it doesn't really matter. Somewhere in adolescence, we develop the abstract capacity to actually witness what our consciousness is doing, and therefore the capacity to choose. From that point on, how we choose is really important. And how we choose has to be guided by a different source than the learnings we've been exposed to until then. We have to seek spiritual sources that really speak to us in very coherent terms about developing the discipline to understand and deepen our choices. So I also share a Baha'i spiritual perspective, and I really appreciate the very contemporary language with which this perspective has spoken to my soul about the breadth and depth and complexity of choices. And so it has given me a frame of reference vis-a-vis which I can constantly examine and be aware of my choices and redirect my choices. It's like in meditation, your mind drifts away and then you bring it back to center. And of course it drifts away again, you bring it back. And then people say, oh, this is so tortuous. That's all I'm doing. I'm doing nothing. I'm just fighting my mind, my monkey brain. You're actually doing a lot. You're developing a spiritual muscle. You're developing the muscle of self-observation and the muscle to redirect your monkey brain, to tell your monkey brain you're not in charge or no longer. So that's doing a lot. Spiritually, developing that spiritual muscle to observe with a measure of detachment my own choices, and instead of immediately coming up with a narrative of why my choices are so great, which we're all very good at, being able to just contemplate them with a quiet mind from a place of connection to the beyond, to the source, however we refer to that source, from a place of loving contemplative connection with the source, to observe my choices and just witness what arises within me. That is already the realm of the spiritual. And when we learn how much it is this practice that actually integrates the human personality, we will start to talk collectively about the essential nature of that practice in global health. But we're not there because the physicalist paradigm is still very dominant. It's dominant in society, and it is dominant in the way society is structured. Just think about how our economic interactions globally, what are they based on, and how are they oriented? And of course, we're not talking about spiritual ontology because it's so inconvenient. Then we'll have to just change the way we do business. We'll have to change the way we think about resources, change the way we think about distributing resources. We have to change everything. And who wants that? We've got our way, except that the planet is forcing us now. So we'll see what happens. This awakening will be inevitable at some point, tragically so. It doesn't look like we're going to voluntarily go into it. That was the main premise that really propelled me to write Global Unitive Healing. I wrote it during the pandemic because when the pandemic hit and human unwellness really spiraled, mental and emotional and spiritual and perplexity, I felt that it was time to speak to that individual and collective unwellness and really lay out what this is about and where it's pointing us to. And that's the whole point of the book. It begins with the individual journey and it moves into the journey of communities and then goes to the global journey because that's our context. And all of that is our awakening to the now urgent need to redefine reality, how we come to know reality, how we relate to reality, how we work with reality. That's what is happening in the world. And in this book, I say very clearly that while the turbulence will continue, if we understand what we're living, it is a lot less stressful. And it is a lot more possible for us as parents, as individuals, as communities, to consciously choose how we position ourselves in relation to that turbulence, how we participate in it. And that is already a game changer. Knowing what you're living, as I like to help people understand it in physicalist terms, when you don't know what you're living, it is literally living you. It's pushing you from here. It's living you. But when you bring it into full awareness and are able to see what it is you're living, then you have all kinds of spiritually empowered choices that you can make. And it's a lot less there. I think we've covered a lot of ground here.
We really did.
Yeah, we may need to give people the opportunity to process that and come back with more thoughts and questions, because this is really the micro and the macro brought together, which is the nature of my work. We become present and we relate to reality moment by moment, as in yogic practice, magnificent practice that teaches people to be present. And that's another thing I ask my clients to do. One is guided meditation. The other one is some kind of mind-body practice, preferably yoga. But if you'd like to do any kind of other mind-body practice, that's fine too. Tai Chi is great. Qigong is great. Any of the martial arts work really beautifully. So these are two things that I always ask the people I work with to engage in, because they're very central to this journey. But these practices all help us really come back to the micro moment. But in my book, I try to explain that the micro moment and the macro moment, the historical transformation moment that we're living, are woven together like amoeba strip. You cannot separate them. You have to understand both the micro and the macro and the dynamic between them in order to feel fully empowered. And that was the effort behind that book. However much or little it succeeds, it's a step in that direction.
What you shared about the heart is our favorite topic on Yoga avec moi, because on the YAM podcast specifically, because the YAM podcast, it's actually a seed sound in yoga of the heart chakra. And even though it just happens to be that our Yoga avec moi, the abbreviation of it is the seed sound of the heart, the reason why this is called the YAM podcast is because the only thing that really should exist in the human heart is universal love. And it's actually exactly as you said, the seat of God, really. And I always correct people when they say, I love you from my heart. I love you, baby, like you're my heart's desire. I'm like, no, you love them depending on if they're your family. You love them from your first chakra, from your sit bones, or from your second chakra with your lover, and yourself through your navel. But your heart is only for one thing, and that's for God. Because anything else that is placed in it is a reduction of that universal love, and that you don't get to experience the full breadth of God's love if you put anything else in the human heart. And what you shared about public health, I love it so much, the global health, even though you mentioned like how we would really need to completely, there's so much that we need to talk about, but we will end soon. But this aspect of like commerce, that we would have to do commerce completely differently if we recognized our spiritual perspective. I'm sure you are aware of actually the initial inklings, even though that is completely the reality right now. We are completely economically tied, and the reasons why we need to change, most people would argue from the economic perspective. But the reason why, this is a aspect of history that a lot of people don't know, how we really galvanize the global movement of commerce actually began with the spiritual law of Umrah and Hajj, to go on pilgrimage. This was actually the Islamic, Muhammad talked about the 5 pillars of Islam, one being of prayer, and one pillar in Islam being that of pilgrimage. And in those days, for the prophet to actually speak about pilgrimage was actually almost like a life and death situation. And I love Hajj so much, Mecca and Medina so much, because they were actually the first inklings of global health, because all of the believers would come over a journey of 7 months. If they even made it to Mecca and Medina, it was the place where infectious diseases would spread. And so of all the world's history, we have so much depth of knowledge in Mecca and Medina of how to control infectious diseases. There's a lot of ancient history, but it's because of the spiritual law that people actually, because they were on the journey for 7 months, they would have to literally take their shops with them and sell along the way. And then somehow they would have to find a way to keep moving in order to get to their final destination. And this, I always share this with people, that even the reason why we're even globalized to begin with is actually fundamentally, it comes from that spiritual law that was given. And so it doesn't even make sense. And it was secondarily was the economics that kind of slowly made its way there in order to be able to fulfill this spiritual law. But a lot of people now don't understand or don't know their history of that's actually where it came from, and that we actually really have to praise and thank Muslims for our globalization, in that they were like the beginnings of like creating a globalized world, in that each of these like pit stops almost, where people would come and they would sell their things in order to move on to their journey, it was them obeying the spiritual law that gives us this economic bounty that we all share, that we're able to get different foods like whenever we want, like in different seasons, and things that maybe cause other health problems. But the beginnings of that is actually spiritual, is the obedience to a spiritual law. And I love to point that out because it helps us trace back to that history, because it's not what we're practicing now was not the origin of how we even came about it. And maybe I'll just end. Go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt you, but I wanted to just mention here, as we're wrapping up, 2 things. One is that in a very comparable way, we now see the early arising of the transformation in business through the B Corp. The B Corp movement, which is the conscious business movement that is recognizing that business is only going to thrive as long as we are planetarily conscious with how we use resources. And so the B Corp movement is an example of taking spiritual awareness to that next level that will eventually reconstruct the way we do economy on a global level. And if I may, just because we wanted to touch on language, hopefully we will talk about that during another encounter. But I just wanted to say that as we are recognizing the power of language to shape us, we are also learning not just exposure to different spiritual and historic languages. And I really appreciate what you share about history, because that's a very valuable way to inform our language by this historical perspective. So language, we become conscious of language from a macro angle, which is being exposed to different systems of language and thought. We also become more mindful that the micro moment in how we use language is equally important. So, for example, I will give here examples with our mindless use of language as cool, awesome, exciting, I love this, I love that. As you were saying, love actually just means one thing, but we keep saying, I love this and I love that. Or, oh, that's so incredible. There's all kinds of mindless comments that we make, fillers, as we talk, that are signals that we're not fully present to the spiritual encounter in the moment and are starting to get carried away in our own heads. And so that's probably a good way to wrap up for today. Is one of the things I actually invite clients to consider doing when we start work is to slow down their speech enough that they're conscious of making pauses between every few words, because that is the pause of bringing yourself back from where your mind has taken you off in various tangents, and to also become aware of your choice of words and the pauses that allow things to truly sink in and gain weight and significance. And then a thought becomes more whole. Instead of 5 thoughts, 1 thought comes out, but it's whole and it's mindful. And again, language is the next level of this conversation, and we can think about language both in the macro narratives that we draw from and the micro moment ways that we use language increasingly mindfully, hopefully, that allow us to come into the wholeness of our being and express wholeness of thought rather than multiplicity and large quantity of thoughts. And so I want to really thank you for this wonderful dialogue and for all the very thoughtful and informed perspectives that you brought forth. I certainly learned from you as well and appreciated that very much. And I'm sure your listeners really appreciate that very much as well. It's really a pleasure to be in this conversation.
A delight, an absolute delight. And I can't wait to read your book. It's going to be my number one thing that I do after we hang up here. I'm going to be like, go read the book right now.
Watch out. The moment you decide to do that, 10,000 things are going to come your way to distract and pull you away. It's just how life happens. But the intention is there. And when the moment is right, you'll come to it.
It's been the book that I've been wanting to go to. I know you have even more books than this. And so it was, for me, it was really, actually, could you name the other books that you have to share with the group? So I will definitely be leaving links in the podcast for everyone to go check out.
All 3 books are actually available on Amazon.
Excellent.
And until I lived in the US, and so I know that they're all available on the US Amazon. I don't know about other Amazon branches, but probably are. The first one is Critical Consciousness. I've really forgotten the title of it.
Don't worry, we'll have all of the books and
yes. It's about critical. The main title is Critical Consciousness, and the subtitle is, I believe, Morality in a global age, or the ontogeny of morality in a global age. And that was my research on consciousness and how we become discerning. What are the developed? So this was really my doctoral research that came out in a book afterwards on
Wow.
the social science behind the evolution of consciousness and the growth in discernment. So that was critical consciousness. That was my first book. And it's a lot more academic because that was the nature of the work at the time. The second one is a volume of which I was the senior editor, towards a socially responsible psychology for a global age. And that was an effort of our team to really review psychology as it currently stands and orient it towards the spiritual dimension, which is so lacking in psychology, in mainstream psychology, and which makes it really inadequate to meet the social needs of our times. And then this third book was intended to be practical. This one is not, it still surveils the territory because you can't but do that in a global age. But the intention is to help people use it as a practical guide. It has appendix with practices and reflection questions for each chapter. So the idea is to really assist people, to accompany people to go on a personal journey.
We love that in yoga, as we're all about that personal journey. The more reflection questions that you give us and practices, we're like, we just eat that up like rice. We love that. Thank you so much for sharing that with that. I'm glad we talked about the 3 books so that people can go buy it. We'll definitely leave the link down in the podcast. Thank you guys so much for listening, and we will see you next week. Bye, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed that podcast. We're going to leave all of the details of Dr. Elena's books in the podcast, in the blogs. So definitely check it out. All the links and the resources are going to be your go-to for sure. I'm also going to link to you the YouTube series that I was talking about in the beginning of the episodes. I'm definitely gonna, by the time you listen to this, I would have definitely finished all of the episodes. I know it's gonna be good. I've had so many people recommend her to me and speak to her already, and yeah, I can't believe we just had her on the YAM Podcast, guys. Oh my gosh, this is so exciting. One gem to keep on the YAM Podcast forever. If you guys would like to hear the YAM membership portal that she did, definitely come and check it out. We don't know what the theme is going to be on, but I already know from the conversation that we just had that it's going to be amazing. And we will see you in the next episode, guys. Bye.